Could the Germans have won the Battle of Stalingrad? The Germans were so close to victory at Stalingrad. At the time of the Soviet counterattack, the Germans had captured about 90% of the city, but they lost due to constant underestimation of enemy forces. Hitler in 1942 believed that the Red Army was about to collapse, and he acted according to that, expanding the scope of the operation, and sending some units to rest in France, the Panzergrenadier Division Großdeutschland and the 1st Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, which could have been used to establish a motorized reserve near Stalingrad to react to any Soviet breakthrough. Supply problems. The Axis forces at Stalingrad needed at least 12 trains a day to fight effectively, but only about 4 trains a day reached Stalingrad. To supply their forces they used 2 main railroads, the Western and Southern Railroads. The Western Railroad started at Gorlovka and ended in Gumrak. The Southern Railroad started at Rostov and ended in Tingada. Soviet planning and resistance. Fighting in Stalingrad was sapping German forces. They had to pull units from the flanks to continue advancing, which left their flanks weakly defended by incompetent Italian and Romanian forces. The Soviets used this for their own advantage, by attacking them, encircling the German units there. This was the first time the Soviets were able to outsmart the Germans. Later, history would show us that it wouldn't be the last. No chance. Once Hitler separated Army Group South into Army Group B towards Stalingrad and Army Group A towards Baku, the strategic game was up. Hitler only did so because the Soviets were retreating from initial blows from AGS, partly because of morale and actual disintegration, and subsequently because this resulted in no great encirclements of Soviet forces. Hitler misread this as Soviet collapse, perhaps thinking of World War I. However, after the division of AGS, the Germans encountered subsequent stiffening Soviet resistance while simultaneously moving further apart from each other. Neither divided army group had any realistic chance of achieving either objective, as each simply did not have the strength/numbers. This situation began to be misread by Hitler and the High Command. Many state that the Germans almost took Stalingrad, citing this as winning the battle. It is true the Germans were on the verge of taking the city of Stalingrad, but this is utterly irrelevant, and could arguably have made things even worse if they had consolidated there. Taking the city itself was irrelevant. The Soviet encirclement was far behind the city. Army Group South's center of gravity had moved so far forward/eastward, and it was otherwise stretched so thin that the Soviets were astonished that they had surrounded the number of German units that they had in the Stalingrad pocket. This suggests that the Germans were very overconfident, as well as negligent. The Germans, or more precisely Hitler, had ignored some basic tenets of warfare. While Army Group A and B were separating further and further in time and space, the Soviet counterattack and encirclement of 6th Army, Army Group B, had conversely consolidated their own forces, and there was realistically nothing the Germans could do about it, as they had no reserve to speak of. Hitler initially thought he could relieve the city, again underestimating the Soviets, but as he had no ready reserve, this had allowed the successful Soviet double envelopment in depth in the first place. The number of troops on the southern front slightly favored the Soviets, but it was their concentration of force on one point, the area surrounding Stalingrad, where the Germans were out on a limb and ultimately encircled, that doomed Case Blau into a slow grinding rout, stabilized only later by Manstein's famous backhand towards Kharkiv in early 1943 after the city's surrender. However, this was also the case of the Soviets in turn overplaying their hand. Case Blau had the realistic strength to take Stalingrad, keeping AGS in one force, and threaten the Caucasus supply lines to Moscow in 1943 by air, and then attempt to survive considerable Soviet counterattacks, but nothing more. There is no realistic way even a combined AGS could take or reach Astrakhan and then defend it. Case Blau did not have the strength to take Stalingrad, then drive on to Astrakhan and simultaneously take Baku. Hitler's delusions made him badly underestimate the Soviets, and the Soviets made him pay. Fall Blau, or Case Blue, had 3 targets when it was carried out. 1. Destroy Soviet forces facing German Army Group South. 2. Reach the Volga and prevent supply of oil from Caucasus to the rest of the Su-3. Capture of the Caucasus oil fields. The Germans were successful on 1 and 2 and partly on 3. So what went wrong? 1. They could not hold the line. 2. The primary assumption of the OKH, based on faulty intelligence reports, was that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. 3. It was not. Reserves were available and plenty. This was why the OKH was content with keeping the flanks of the 6th Army lightly guarded with satellite armies. Also remember that Stalingrad for all practical purposes actually did fall into German hands, except 2 tiny pockets bordering the Volga. German forces reached the Volga on both sides of the city by September as well. The city center, the factories etc. were all in German hands by mid-October. Let's dismiss these myths. There are more. 1. Hitler wanted Stalingrad because it bore Stalin's name. Nonsense. The Plan Blue did not have that as a part of the plan. The city was important because it was the route to the Caucasus along the Volga. 2. It was Hitler's fault that the flanks were unprotected. Not true. Hitler had instructed the Army Group South repeatedly before November to improve rear defenses in the Hungarian and Italian sectors with reserve German panzer divisions disengaged from the 6th Army. But these were ignored. Only a weak 22 Panzer Division was made available. 3. Intelligence was partially correct on the Soviet build-up. Geklin did mention, correctly, that the main or more vigorous assault will be against the Army Group Center, Operation Mars, and a smaller one in the south. But the preparations, extraction of reserves, were not done. Mistakes done by the German Army. 1. Insufficient reserves in the rear of the satellite armies. 2. Unwillingness of German commanders taking the city to loan their beloved panzer forces to fire brigade duties. 3. Hitler's changing of the tactical axis of operations to take both objectives 2 and 3 at the same time. 4. Unwillingness of the 6th Army to establish a bridgehead on the Volga and totally encircle Stalingrad when on the march itself. 5. Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the army, was one of the worst army commanders of the German army. Utterly unimaginative, lacking drive, he was the exact type of leader the 6th Army did not need. His role is often ignored. Anthony Beevor's classic Stalingrad book gives the details. To sum up, the Germans could have taken the city and held it if 1. They invested lesser forces to street fighting and focused first on encircling the city entirely, something they always used to do. 2. Maintained the mobility of the motorized and panzer divisions and kept them as reserves. 3. Have a more talented commander of the 6th Army, one with more initiative. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing for more videos to deepen your mind.